Before we start, let us know where you are tuning in from. Your city, your country, and the current time there. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and give this video a like. It really helps our channel grow and allows more people to uncover these overlooked stories. We are truly grateful for your support. Stick with us until the very end, because this is a narrative you won't want to miss a single moment of. Take a breath, clear away any distractions, and focus closely as we begin. In Charleston, South Carolina, during the year 1822, fear moved quietly through the nighttime streets. The city appeared tranquil on the outside. Ships arrived and departed from the harbor. Wealthy white families attended church and social events. Enslaved individuals worked in homes, markets, and workshops. But underneath that calm exterior, something was brewing. Something formidable. Something that would challenge the very core of slavery in the South. At the heart of this storm stood a man named Denmark Vesey. He was not born with that name. He was born in the Caribbean around 1767. As a child, he was captured and sold into bondage. He was brought to Charleston by a slave trader. For years he lived as property, forced to obey, forced to labor, forced to endure in a world that viewed him as subhuman. But Denmark Vesey was different. He possessed the ability to read. He had the capacity for deep thought. He could speak with force. And most importantly, he never accepted slavery in his spirit. In 1799, something happened that altered his life. Denmark Vesey won a lottery. The prize was substantial enough for him to purchase his own freedom. Picture that moment. A man who had known shackles, suddenly standing as a free man in a slave city. But his freedom did not extend to his wife. It did not extend to his children. They remained in bondage. He attempted to buy them, but their enslaver refused. That refusal burned inside him like an unquenchable flame. As a free black man in Charleston, Vesey worked as a carpenter. He earned wages. He attended church. He became a leader in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, a space where enslaved and free black people gathered to worship and speak openly. Yet within that church, discussions went beyond prayer. They talked of liberty. They talked of Haiti, where enslaved people had risen and overcome their oppressors. They talked of righteousness. And slowly, quietly, Denmark Vesey began to formulate a plan. Charleston in 1822 was a city constructed on fear. White slaveholders dreaded rebellion. They feared the memory of Haiti. They feared the swelling number of enslaved people in the state. At night, patrols moved through the streets. Laws were severe. Punishments were brutal. Still, even in that atmosphere of fear, Vesey saw an opening. He believed slavery was a sin. He believed God did not endorse bondage. And he believed that action, not words, would bring transformation. Vesey began to speak privately with trusted men. One of them was Peter Poyas, an enslaved man who was strong and respected among his peers. Another was Gullah Jack, known for his spiritual influence and bravery. These men did not act from anger alone. They acted with deliberate consideration. They knew that if they failed, death would be the consequence, but they also knew that living forever in chains was a slow death in itself. The plan was audacious. On a designated night, enslaved men from plantations and the city would rise together. They would seize weapons. They would kill slaveholders who resisted. They would set parts of the city ablaze. They would take command of Charleston. Then they would sail to Haiti, where a free black republic already existed. This was not random violence. It was organized revolution. It was an attempt to eradicate slavery at its foundation. Meetings were held in secrecy. Messages were passed quietly from person to person. Vesey used the Bible to reinforce his words, pointing to stories of liberation and justice. He reminded them that the Israelites had escaped bondage. He reminded them that God heard the cries of the oppressed. As the months passed, hundreds of men were said to be involved. The network extended across plantations and into the countryside. The dream of freedom grew more powerful. But every revolution carries risk. Trust can be broken. Fear can turn courage into betrayal. As the planned date approached in June of 1822, tension filled the air. The city did not yet know what was coming, but whispers moved through dark corners. Some enslaved men felt afraid. The punishment for rebellion was known to all. Torture, hanging, heads placed on spikes as warnings. One man, whose name history records with bitterness, revealed the plan to his enslaver. We do not know all the reasons why he spoke. Perhaps he feared death. Perhaps he believed the revolt would fail. Whatever his reason, his words changed everything. The white authorities were alerted. Panic spread among Charleston's leaders. They could scarcely believe that such a large uprising had been forming under their noses. The city responded quickly. The militia was summoned. Suspected leaders were arrested. Homes were searched. Churches were closed. Vesey himself was taken into custody. He did not confess. He did not plead. He remained resolute, but under pressure. Other arrested men gave statements. The authorities claimed they had uncovered a massive conspiracy involving hundreds. Whether every detail was true or exaggerated, the fear was real. Secret trials were conducted. These were not fair proceedings. The accused had no proper defense. Evidence was thin. Confessions were coerced. Yet, the verdicts were severe. Death sentences were handed down one after another. Denmark Vesey was condemned. So were many of his closest allies. The city that had feared rebellion now demonstrated its power through punishment. On a summer morning in July of 1822, Denmark Vesey was led to his execution. Alongside him stood Peter Poyas and several others. They were hanged in silence. There was no grand speech recorded, no final words preserved in detail, but their actions had already spoken loudly. They had dared to envision a world without chains. In total, 35 men were executed. Many more were deported or sold away from Charleston. The African Methodist Episcopal Church was burned to the ground. Laws became even more restrictive. Patrols increased. The white population convinced itself that it had crushed a dangerous threat. Yet something deeper had been exposed. Enslaved people were not passive. They were thinking, planning, waiting. The story of Vesey was twisted by slaveholders who called him a villain. They painted him as a monster. But to many enslaved people, he became a symbol of courage. Even in defeat, his attempt proved that organized resistance was possible. It proved that fear lived on both sides of slavery. For years after, Charleston carried the memory of 1822 like a scar. Every rumor of rebellion brought his name back into whispered conversations. Denmark Vesey had failed in his mission, but he had shaken one of the strongest slave cities in America. Why does this story matter today? It matters because it shows that resistance did not begin with the Civil War. It did not begin with famous names we hear in school. It existed long before, in secret meetings, in whispered prayers, in bold plans drawn in darkness. Denmark Vesey was a free man by law, but he could not rest while his people were enslaved. His freedom meant nothing without justice. His plan was not born from blind rage. It was born from years of watching families torn apart, from seeing wives and children sold away, from hearing the crack of the whip, from reading scripture and believing that God did not support oppression. Whether one sees him as hero or rebel, his story forces us to face a truth. Slavery created violence long before any uprising began. The fear that followed his execution shaped Southern law for decades. Restrictions tightened. Black churches were watched closely. Education for enslaved people became even more restricted. White leaders understood something important. Knowledge and unity were powerful weapons. Vesey had used both. As you sit watching this story, Think about the courage it took to plan such a revolt in a city filled with patrols and spies. Think about the quiet strength required to stand trial, knowing death was certain. Denmark Vesey did not live to see freedom come to Charleston, but his shadow remained. And in the shadows of Black history, his name still whispers of unfinished dreams and bold resistance. The executions in Charleston did not end the fear. They deepened it. In the days after Denmark Vesey and his allies were hanged, the city felt tense and watchful. Militia units stayed armed. Night patrols doubled. White citizens began to see danger in every gathering of Black men. They feared that even after the arrests, others might still be planning something. And in truth, what frightened them most was not the weapons that had been planned. It was the idea. The idea that enslaved people could think, organize, and strike together with purpose. The authorities wanted answers. They wanted names. They wanted proof that they had crushed every part of the network. More arrests followed. More interrogations took place behind closed doors. Enslaved men were questioned for hours. Some were whipped to force confessions. Others were threatened with death if they did not speak. Under that pressure, stories grew larger. The conspiracy seemed to expand with every testimony. Whether all of it was true did not matter. The city believed it had nearly been destroyed from within. Charleston's leaders began to study the revolt carefully. They asked themselves how such a plan could have formed. They examined the church where Vesey had preached. They studied the movement of free Black carpenters, dock workers, and laborers who had contact with enslaved people across plantations. They realized that mobility had been a key factor. Freed Black men like Vesey could move between neighborhoods. They could speak to many people without raising immediate suspicion. That mobility became a target. Within months, laws tightened further. Restrictions were placed on free Black residents. Curfews were enforced more strictly. Any sign of independent Black organization was treated as a threat. The African Methodist Episcopal Church, once a place of spiritual hope, had been destroyed. Its ashes served as a warning. White authorities believed they had restored order. But beneath that forced calm, resentment did not disappear. It went deeper underground. To understand why Vesey's plan had grown so large, we must look beyond Charleston itself. News traveled slowly in those days, but it traveled. The Haitian Revolution had taken place just years earlier. In Haiti, enslaved people had risen up, defeated French forces, and established an independent Black nation. That event shocked the world. It proved that slavery could be broken by force. It showed that white power was not unshakable. In Charleston, sailors arrived from Caribbean ports with stories. Some whispered of Toussaint Louverture and Jean Jacques Dessalines. They spoke of plantations burned and armies formed by former slaves. Those stories spread quietly among Black communities. For men like Denmark Vesey, Haiti was not just news. It was proof. Proof that what seemed impossible could be done. Slaveholders understood this connection. They feared foreign influence. They feared the sea, which carried not just goods but ideas. Charleston was a major port city. Ships from the Caribbean docked regularly. Each arrival was watched more closely after 1822. Authorities inspected vessels and questioned Black sailors. They wanted to block any outside inspiration that could fuel another uprising. But ideas cannot be locked away like cargo. Even as patrols increased, the memory of Vesey's plan lingered. Enslaved people continued to talk in fields, in kitchens, and along the docks. They spoke carefully. They trusted slowly. They remembered what had happened to those who had been caught. Yet they also remembered the boldness of the attempt. For some, it became a quiet source of strength. The families of those executed suffered greatly. When a man was hanged for rebellion, His wife and children remained enslaved. They carried the burden of his punishment. Some were sold away from Charleston as a precaution. Plantation owners feared that relatives of rebels might seek revenge. Families were scattered across South Carolina and beyond. In this way, the revolt did not just claim lives. It tore apart communities. We must imagine what it felt like for those families. A wife watching her husband taken in chains. A child hearing whispers that his father had tried to bring freedom. Pride and grief mixed together. Fear and admiration living side by side. The official records list names and sentences. They do not record tears. They do not record the silent courage of those left behind. Yet those human details are part of the story. White citizens also lived with fear. Some began to treat enslaved workers with slightly more caution. Others responded with even greater cruelty. They believed that harsh discipline would prevent rebellion. In reality, cruelty often fuels resistance. The cycle continued. Slavery created anger. Anger created fear. Fear created more control. And control created more anger. Charleston's newspapers described the plot as evil and wicked. They portrayed Vesey as dangerous and ungrateful. But even in their attempts to condemn him, they revealed something powerful. They admitted that hundreds had been willing to follow him. That fact alone showed that dissatisfaction with slavery was widespread. The system was not as stable as slaveholders wanted to believe. Years passed, but the shadow of 1822 did not fade. Younger generations of enslaved people heard about the planned revolt from elders who had lived through it. They learned about secret meetings and whispered plans. They learned about betrayal and punishment. These stories became part of a hidden tradition of resistance. When Nat Turner led his revolt in Virginia in 1831, many Southern leaders remembered Vesey. They connected the two events. Even though they were separated by distance and time, they feared a pattern. They feared that rebellion was spreading like a quiet disease. The memory of Vesey strengthened that fear. Historians later debated whether the Charleston plot had truly been as large as authorities claimed. Some argue that white officials exaggerated the threat to justify harsh laws. Others believe the network was indeed vast and carefully organized. What remains clear is that Denmark Vesey had the intelligence and determination to attempt something extraordinary. His position as a free black man gave him access and influence that few others possessed. Today, his name is not as widely known as some other figures. Yet his attempt came nearly 4 decades before the Civil War. It challenged slavery at a time when the institution seemed deeply rooted. It exposed the fragile foundation beneath Southern confidence. And it showed that even in a city filled with watchful eyes, the desire for freedom could grow bold enough to plan a revolution. As we continue this journey in shadows of Black history, ask yourself a question. What drives a man to risk certain death? Denmark Vesey had legal freedom. He had work. He had a community. Yet he chose to endanger it all. The answer may lie in something simple. Freedom for one while others suffer is not true freedom. He saw children sold away. He saw families broken. He saw chains on people who shared his skin and his faith. He read scripture and believed that justice was not only possible but necessary. His faith and his anger joined together. That combination created resolve. Though his revolt did not take place, its impact was real. It tightened the grip of slavery. Yet it also revealed cracks in the system. Every act of resistance, even a failed one, adds pressure to injustice. Over time, that pressure builds. Stay with us as we move deeper into this story. In the next part, we will explore how Vesey's legacy influenced later resistance, how Charleston rebuilt its walls of control, and how the spirit of rebellion refused to die, even under the harshest watch. After the executions, Charleston tried to convince itself that everything was under control. The streets looked the same. The markets opened at sunrise. Ships continued to arrive at the harbor carrying rice, cotton, sugar, and news from distant lands. But something had changed. Trust had been broken. Fear had become permanent. White slaveholders no longer saw the enslaved population as quiet laborers. They saw them as potential soldiers, waiting for the right moment. The militia increased its presence. Armed patrols rode through the city at night, with sharper eyes and tighter grips on their weapons. Any gathering of black men was questioned. Any whisper in a church was treated as a possible conspiracy. Even free black citizens were required to carry documents at all times to prove their status. The city did not just punish the rebels. It punished the entire black community. But punishment does not erase memory. It does not silence ideas. It only drives them underground. Enslaved men continued to talk, but more carefully. They spoke while pretending to work. They shared news in coded language. They learned from what had happened. They understood that betrayal had destroyed the plan. They understood that secrecy must be even stronger next time. Denmark Vesey had shown them something important. He had shown that a free black man could challenge the system directly. He had shown that leadership could come from within their own community. He had shown that fear existed on both sides. White Charleston had trembled in 1822. That trembling could not be undone. As the years passed, children who had been young during the arrests grew into adults. They remembered the tension in their homes. They remembered the sudden disappearance of fathers and brothers. They remembered the church being burned. Some grew up hearing stories whispered late at night about what almost happened. The revolt had failed, but it had entered legend. At the same time, white leaders worked hard to rewrite the story. They called Vesey a criminal. They described the planned uprising as savage and evil. They used the event to justify harsher laws. Education for enslaved people became even more restricted. Teaching a black person to read was treated as a dangerous act. They feared that knowledge had helped Vesey organize. Yet knowledge cannot be fully stopped. Even without formal education, people learned through experience. They learned through listening. They learned through observing the behavior of those in power. And what they saw was clear. Slavery depended on control. It depended on fear. It depended on the belief that resistance was impossible. Vesey had proven that resistance was very possible. Beyond Charleston, news of the conspiracy spread to other southern states. Plantation owners in Georgia, North Carolina, and Virginia heard about the planned march to seize the city and sail to Haiti. Some dismissed it as exaggerated rumor. Others prepared for similar threats in their own regions. The idea of organized revolt became part of Southern anxiety. The United States government also watched carefully. Louisiana had already experienced the German Coast Uprising in 1811. Now South Carolina had nearly exploded. Leaders began to understand that slavery carried constant risk. The nation depended economically on enslaved labor. Yet that labor force was restless. Every act of violence by a master increased the possibility of retaliation. Every family separated created new anger. Still, life continued. Plantations operated. Crops were harvested. Children were born into bondage. To outside observers, slavery appeared stable. But stability built on force is fragile. It requires constant pressure to maintain. The memory of Vesey forced slaveholders to apply that pressure more aggressively. For Denmark Vesey himself, history left limited records of his personal thoughts during imprisonment. We do not have a detailed diary. We do not have letters written from his cell. What we have are fragments from trial testimony and reports written by those who feared him. Even through those hostile sources, a picture emerges of a man who believed deeply in justice. A man who was calm under questioning. A man who did not betray others even when facing death. It is easy to forget how bold his plan truly was. Charleston was one of the wealthiest slave cities in the South. It had strong militia forces. It had powerful political leaders. Attempting to seize it was not a small act of rebellion. It was an act of war. Vesey was not planning a single attack on a plantation. He was planning a complete overthrow of local authority. Imagine the night if it had succeeded. Fires lighting the sky. Militia caught unprepared. Ships seized at the harbor. Hundreds marching together toward freedom. That image alone explains why white Charleston reacted with such severity. They had seen how close they might have come to losing everything. And yet, even though the uprising never took place, it changed the course of black resistance in subtle ways. It showed that organization across plantations was possible. It showed that religion could serve as a meeting place for political ideas. It showed that leadership did not always come from the field. Sometimes it came from skilled workers, from carpenters, from men who could read and speak persuasively. Over time, the story of Denmark Vesey moved beyond South Carolina. Abolitionists in the North learned about the conspiracy. Some quietly admired the courage involved. Others worried that violent revolt would damage the moral argument against slavery. Debates grew stronger as the nation moved closer to division. But for the enslaved population, the meaning was simpler. Vesey had tried. He had dared. He had refused to accept that chains were permanent. His execution was meant to frighten them into submission. Instead, it left a lasting example of defiance. As you continue listening, consider how power reacts when challenged. It rarely responds with calm reflection. It responds with force. That was true in 1822, and it remains true in many struggles across history. The story is not just about one man. It is about a city living in tension. It is about a system that required violence to survive. It is about faith, betrayal, courage, and consequence. And we are only halfway through. Charleston never truly slept again after the summer of 1822. Even when the streets appeared calm and the harbor winds blew softly against the wooden docks, there was a tension in the air that had not existed before. White families, who once walked confidently through their gardens, now glanced over their shoulders. Plantation owners, who once believed their control was absolute, now checked their doors twice before going to bed. They told themselves that the danger had passed, that Denmark Vesey and his followers were gone, that the rope had solved the problem. But deep inside, they knew something far more troubling. The idea had survived. The executions had been meant to erase hope. 35 men hanged, others sold away, the church destroyed. Public warnings delivered, heads displayed as a message of terror. It was supposed to be final. It was supposed to crush any thought of future rebellion. Yet, suppression often strengthens what it tries to destroy. Enslaved people did not forget what had almost happened. They remembered how close the plan had come to action. They remembered that hundreds had agreed to rise together. That memory gave proof that unity was possible. In the months after the trials, secret conversations became even more careful. Instead of large gatherings, smaller circles formed. Instead of open planning, coded language replaced direct speech. A phrase about weather might mean something else entirely. A hymn sung slowly in the field could carry a second meaning beneath its words. White patrols grew stricter, but surveillance cannot read minds. The enslaved population adapted. They always had to adapt in order to survive. At the same time, Charleston's leaders attempted to study what had gone wrong from their perspective. They questioned how a free black carpenter could organize so many without immediate detection. They examined the role of religion. They blamed the influence of Haiti. They blamed leniency. They blamed the presence of free black communities. Their solution was not reform. Their solution was tighter control, more restrictions, more limits on movement, more fear used as discipline. They believed fear would prevent unity. They underestimated the human desire for freedom. Beyond Charleston, news of the uncovered plot moved slowly through the South. In Georgia and North Carolina, plantation owners held private meetings. In Virginia, older men remembered Gabriel Prosser and compared that earlier conspiracy to Vesey's. The pattern disturbed them. Organized resistance seemed to appear every generation. Even when crushed, it returned. It was like trying to stamp out embers that refused to go cold. For enslaved families, daily life remained harsh. Fields still demanded labor from sunrise to sunset. Overseers still carried whips. Children still grew up knowing that they could be sold at any moment. But under that suffering, something invisible lived. The knowledge that a man once dared to plan the destruction of Charleston itself. Not just one plantation, not just one act of revenge. A complete overthrow. That scale of imagination changed how people viewed their own power. Time moved forward. The year 1831 arrived and news of Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia spread like wildfire. When white Charlestonians heard of the killings in Southampton County, they immediately thought back to Vesey. They saw a connection whether it truly existed or not. Fear returned at full strength. Militias drilled harder. Laws tightened further. Yet again, the response proved something important. The system of slavery depended on constant anxiety. Without fear, it would collapse. Meanwhile, black sailors traveling through Charleston's port continued to carry stories from abroad. Haiti remained independent. British colonies in the Caribbean were debating abolition. Rumors of change circled the Atlantic world. Though literacy among enslaved people was heavily restricted, news traveled by voice. Word of mouth became a powerful network. Vesey had used such networks once. Others learned from that example, even if they never spoke his name aloud. As the nation expanded westward, new territories debated whether slavery would enter their borders. Political arguments grew louder in Washington. Some Southern leaders pointed to revolts like Vesey's conspiracy as proof that slavery required strict protection. They argued that emancipation would lead to chaos. Others quietly recognized that the constant threat of rebellion showed how unstable slavery truly was. Decades passed. Children who had been young in 1822 became elders telling stories in hushed tones. They described secret meetings in back rooms. They described the fear in white faces when arrests began. They described the sound of boots marching through narrow streets at night. These oral histories preserved details that official records ignored. Official records focused on crime. Oral memory focused on courage. Then came the year 1861. The Civil War began. Charleston itself became one of the first battlegrounds when Confederate forces fired upon Fort Sumter. The city that once feared internal rebellion now faced open war. Enslaved people watched carefully as Union forces advanced through Southern territory. Opportunities for escape multiplied. Thousands fled plantations to join Union lines. Many enlisted as soldiers. They carried weapons openly, something Vesey's followers had only planned in secret. By the year 1865, slavery was officially abolished. The chains that Vesey had sought to break were legally removed. Freedom came, but it came through war and bloodshed on a national scale. It came more than 40 years after he had stood on the gallows. One cannot help but wonder what he would have thought if he could see that moment. During Reconstruction, black men in South Carolina entered politics, churches rebuilt, schools opened, communities organized publicly in ways that had once been punishable by death. For a brief period, it seemed that the dream Vesey imagined might fully take shape. But backlash followed quickly. White supremacist groups used violence to regain power. Laws shifted again. Equality remained incomplete. Historians in later generations debated Vezi's character. Some questioned the size of the conspiracy. Some argued that white officials exaggerated the threat. Others insisted that the revolt had indeed been massive and carefully organized. These debates continue. Yet beyond numbers and testimonies stands a simple fact. A formerly enslaved man organized a plan that terrified one of the most powerful slave cities in the South. Modern Charleston has placed markers and memorials acknowledging this history. His name appears in books and discussions of early resistance, but his legacy is complicated. Some view him as a hero of liberation. Others see him through the lens of violence. What cannot be denied is that he forced a conversation that slaveholders wished to avoid. He exposed the truth that slavery rested on unstable ground. As you reflect on this story, consider how power often attempts to control narrative. Those in authority wrote the official reports of 1822. They shaped the language used in newspapers. They framed Vezi as criminal and fanatic. Yet history is rarely owned entirely by those who record it. Memory survives in other forms. Memory survives in whispered stories, in cultural tradition, in the quiet pride of descendants who know that someone once dared to resist openly. Denmark Vezi's revolt never erupted into flames across Charleston's skyline. It ended before it began. Yet its shadow stretched across decades. It influenced laws. It shaped fear. It strengthened resolve on both sides of the struggle. It became part of a larger pattern of resistance that eventually contributed to slavery's collapse. You are still here listening, which means this story continues to matter. The questions it raises are not confined to the past. What happens when justice is denied for too long? What happens when people are treated as property? What happens when faith and anger join together in a single determined mind? Vezi answered those questions in the only way he believed possible. He planned, he organized, he risked everything. His life ended on a rope, but his impact did not. His shadow remains woven into the story of American freedom. And as long as we continue to speak his name, the silence that once surrounded his courage grows weaker. We now move toward the final part of this story, where we will draw together the meaning of his life, the cost of his choice, and the lessons his shadow leaves for us today. Part 5. Long before the rope tightened around his neck in the summer of 1822, Denmark Vezi had already changed the course of Charleston's history. Even in death, he refused to disappear. His body was buried in an unmarked place, his grave never honored at the time. Yet his absence became a presence that haunted the city for generations. The men who ordered his execution believed they had erased a threat. Instead, they created a legend, and legends are harder to kill than men. In the years that followed, the white leadership of South Carolina constructed a new system of control built directly from their fear of Vezi's network. Black churches were placed under strict supervision. Independent gatherings required approval. Laws were passed making it illegal to teach enslaved people to read. The reasoning was clear. Literacy had been part of Vezi's strength. Knowledge had allowed him to interpret scripture, to argue that slavery was a sin, to speak with authority. If knowledge could inspire rebellion, then ignorance would be enforced. But human minds cannot be permanently sealed. Even without formal schooling, enslaved people developed complex systems of communication. Songs carried layered meanings. Spirituals expressed sorrow on the surface, but hinted at deliverance beneath. Stories of Moses leading people out of bondage took on deeper significance. Vezi had once pointed to those same stories in quiet gatherings. After his death, the symbolism remained. It was subtle, but it endured. Charleston itself began to change in visible and invisible ways. The port remained busy. Cotton exports increased year after year. Wealth flowed into the homes of white elites. Yet behind that wealth lived constant vigilance. The militia was not a temporary measure. It became permanent. Patrol schedules were refined. Suspicion became a normal part of daily life. Slavery required not only labor but surveillance. And surveillance required resources and mental energy. It was a burden slaveholders rarely admitted aloud. As the nation moved deeper into political conflict over slavery, Vesey's name surfaced again in debates. Southern defenders of slavery cited the conspiracy as proof that black freedom would bring violence. Abolitionists used the same event to argue that oppression naturally produced resistance. Both sides used his story, but neither could fully control its meaning. That ambiguity kept it alive. When the Civil War erupted and Charleston became a symbol of Confederate defiance, the irony was striking. The city that once feared internal revolt now faced external assault. Enslaved people within the city watched carefully as Union forces blockaded the harbor. Some quietly hoped that the war would finish what Vesey had started in intention. The destruction that came during the war reshaped Charleston's streets and buildings. Cannon fire replaced whispered plans. The conflict Vesey had envisioned on a smaller scale became national. After emancipation, formerly enslaved people sought to rebuild their lives in freedom. They established schools, businesses, and churches. The African Methodist Episcopal Church, once burned after the conspiracy, rose again in new forms. In these spaces, leaders spoke openly about rights and citizenship. The dream of self-determination that Vesey had carried privately now moved into public conversation. Though obstacles remained severe, especially with the rise of violent white supremacist groups, the idea of organized black political power no longer seemed impossible. In later decades, historians began to examine original trial transcripts from 1822. They noticed contradictions in testimonies. They questioned whether some confessions had been forced. They debated whether the number of participants had been inflated. These debates added complexity to the story, but they did not erase its core truth. A serious plan for armed resistance had existed. Fear among Charleston's elite had been real. Executions had been carried out swiftly and harshly. Modern scholars continue to explore Vesey's motivations. Some emphasize his deep religious conviction. Others focus on the influence of the Haitian Revolution. Some analyze his position as a skilled carpenter who moved between social spaces. All agree on one point: he was not impulsive. He was strategic. His planning extended across months. His recruitment process was deliberate. That level of organization challenges stereotypes about enslaved resistance being spontaneous or chaotic. In recent years, Charleston has taken steps to publicly acknowledge this history. Discussions about monuments and memorials have included Vesey's name. Public debates reflect ongoing tension about how to remember figures who used or planned violence in pursuit of freedom. Yet those debates themselves reveal his continuing relevance. A man executed in 1822 still provokes conversation in the 21st century. Consider the courage required to imagine seizing an entire city while living under constant threat of punishment. Consider the psychological strength needed to continue planning, even when betrayal was always possible. Vesey's life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. Slavery was not a peaceful system disrupted by violent rebels. It was a violent system that produced resistance as a natural response. As we close this story, reflect on how history often highlights the victories but forgets the attempts. Not every struggle ends in immediate success. Some end on scaffolds. Some end in silence. Yet each attempt adds weight to the larger movement toward change. Vesey did not live to see emancipation. He did not see Union soldiers march into southern cities. He did not see constitutional amendments abolish slavery. But his willingness to act contributed to the long chain of events that made those outcomes possible. The shadow of Denmark Vesey stretches across American history like a line drawn through time. It connects the whispered meetings of enslaved workers in 1822 to the public protests and political campaigns of later generations. It connects faith with resistance, suffering with courage, fear with determination. His story reminds us that freedom is rarely given willingly by those in power. It is demanded, pursued, and sometimes paid for at the highest cost. Thank you for staying with Shadows of Black History until this moment. Stories like this ask us to think deeply, to question simple narratives, and to understand the complexity of human struggle. If this story moved you, share where you are watching from and what part of it struck you most. History lives when we speak about it, and as long as we continue to explore these hidden chapters, the shadows grow lighter. Part 6. Even after emancipation, even after the guns of the Civil War fell silent, Denmark Vesey's name did not settle quietly into the past. In Charleston, memory itself became a battlefield. Former Confederates rebuilt their version of history quickly. They spoke of honor and states' rights. They erected monuments to generals. They shaped textbooks for their children. But they did not speak proudly about the enslaved man who had nearly turned their city into a battleground decades before the war began. Silence became another form of control. For the newly freed Black community, memory worked differently. Freedom had arrived, but it was fragile. Reconstruction governments allowed Black men to vote and hold office for a brief period. Churches flourished. Schools opened. Families reunited when possible, yet danger remained close. White supremacist groups used intimidation and violence to regain dominance. Night riders moved through rural areas, spreading fear. Under those conditions, remembering Vesey carried risk, but it also carried strength. He represented a tradition of resistance that predated the war. He proved that courage had existed long before federal armies marched south. As the 19th century closed and the 20th century began, laws enforcing racial segregation tightened across the South. These laws, often called Jim Crow laws, restricted movement, education, and opportunity. In many ways, they attempted to rebuild a system of control similar in spirit to slavery, though without formal ownership. During these decades, public discussion of armed resistance faded from mainstream conversation. Survival required caution. Yet in private spaces, stories endured. Vesey's attempt became part of a quiet cultural inheritance passed through families and church communities. In academic circles, scholars slowly began to re-examine early slave revolts. Researchers studied court documents preserved in archives. They read testimonies recorded in 1822. They analyzed newspaper articles from that year. Some concluded that Charleston officials may have exaggerated aspects of the conspiracy to justify repression. Others argued that even if details were unclear, the fear among slaveholders had been genuine. These scholarly debates did not weaken Vesey's significance. They deepened it. They revealed how history is shaped not only by events but by interpretation. By the middle of the 20th century, as the civil rights movement gained strength, activists looked back at earlier generations of resistance. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of nonviolent protest rooted in Christian faith. Others advocated self-defense. Though tactics differed, the principle remained consistent. Freedom required organized effort. In this broader context, Vesey's story resurfaced with new relevance. He had combined faith, organization, and determination long before modern movements existed. Charleston itself transformed over time. Tourism grew. Historic districts were restored. Visitors walked along cobblestone streets admiring old buildings. Yet beneath the beauty lay layers of history that were not always visible. Guides spoke of architecture and trade. Some mentioned slavery in passing. Fewer spoke in depth about the conspiracy that once threatened the entire city. Remembering Vesey required confronting uncomfortable truths about wealth built on forced labor and about fear that shaped public policy. In recent decades, public conversations about monuments and historical memory intensified across the United States. Communities debated which figures deserved statues and which legacies required reconsideration. Within that climate, Vesey's name returned to public discussion in Charleston. Some advocated for memorials recognizing his courage. Others worried about celebrating a man who planned violent uprising. These debates reflected larger national struggles about how to understand resistance against injustice. What cannot be denied is that Vesey's life forces us to examine the moral tension between law and justice. In 1822, the law supported slavery. The law condemned him to death. But justice, viewed from another perspective, may see his actions differently. He believed he was fighting a system that denied basic humanity. Whether one agrees with his method or not, the underlying question remains powerful. When laws defend oppression, what options remain for the oppressed? As you consider that question, think about the cost he accepted. He knew the punishment for conspiracy would be execution. He knew betrayal was possible. He understood the surveillance surrounding him. Yet, he moved forward. Courage is often defined as acting despite fear. Vesey's actions fit that definition. His failure does not erase his bravery. The shadow he cast is not simple. It is not pure heroism nor simple villainy. It is complex, layered, and human. It includes faith, anger, strategy, and risk. It includes the suffering of families left behind and the fear of a city that nearly faced open revolt. It includes debates among historians and arguments among modern citizens. In that complexity lies its power. We are now approaching the final part of this journey. The story began with whispered plans in Charleston. It traveled through execution, memory, war, and reconstruction. It reached into modern debates about justice and remembrance. In the final part, we will bring together the full meaning of Denmark Vesey's life and consider what his shadow teaches us about courage, resistance, and the unfinished work of freedom. The rope that ended Denmark Vesey's life did not silence the deeper question that haunted Charleston. That question lingered long after the crowd dispersed and the bodies were taken down. What if he had succeeded? What if on that chosen night the city had awakened to flames and marching feet? What if the harbor had been seized and ships redirected toward Haiti? These thoughts were not spoken openly among white citizens, but they existed. Fear often hides behind silence. The fear of what almost happened can be stronger than the fear of what did happen. In the decades after 1822, every rumor of unrest carried Vesey's shadow. If an enslaved man refused an order, suspicion followed. If tools went missing, whispers began. If two men stood too long in quiet conversation, patrols took notice. The system of slavery depended on obedience, but obedience enforced by fear is never fully stable. Vesey's plan proved that beneath forced obedience lay calculation and thought. Slaveholders could command labor, but they could not command belief. Imagine the mental world of an enslaved person who had heard about the conspiracy. Work in the fields continued. Cotton still had to be picked. Rice still had to be harvested. Yet inside the mind, there was a memory of possibility. There was a reminder that hundreds once agreed to fight together. Even if they failed, that memory altered how oppression felt. It introduced the idea that power was not eternal. That thought alone is powerful. White authorities tried to frame the conspiracy as madness, as reckless evil. They described Vesey as dangerous and ungrateful. But such language reveals more about their fear than about his character. A man who plans carefully for months is not acting from sudden rage. He is acting from conviction. Vesey had seen his wife remain enslaved while he walked free. He had watched children sold away. He had listened to scripture and interpreted it through the lens of justice. Whether one agrees with his path or not, his motivation was rooted in moral reasoning as he understood it. As the nation approached the breaking point that would lead to civil war, tension increased across the South. Political debates grew louder. Newspapers argued over states' rights and federal authority. Enslaved people listened carefully. They understood that conflict between white political leaders might create opportunity. Just as Vesey had studied global events like the Haitian Revolution, others studied the divisions forming within the United States. When war finally erupted in 1861, Charleston stood at the center once again. Cannon fire at Fort Sumter signaled the beginning of a national struggle. For enslaved people in the city, the sound of those cannons must have carried layered meaning. Nearly 40 years earlier, Vesey had imagined armed conflict in those same streets. Now war had arrived from outside. The destruction that followed reshaped the South completely. After emancipation, freedom brought hope, but also hardship. Formerly enslaved people had to build lives with little property and few resources. Yet, they built churches, schools, and communities with determination. Some of the first independent black congregations in Charleston carried forward traditions of worship that had existed even before 1822. In those spaces, memory survived. The story of Vesey was not always told loudly, but it was not forgotten. As Reconstruction governments formed, black leaders entered public office in South Carolina. Laws were rewritten. The promise of equality seemed possible for a short time. In that era, the idea of organized black political action was no longer secret. It was public. That transformation from hidden conspiracy to open participation marks one of the great shifts in American history. Vesey had imagined collective power in secret. Reconstruction briefly made that power visible. Yet, backlash came swiftly. White supremacist violence aimed to restore dominance. Poll taxes and literacy tests later restricted voting rights. Segregation hardened. The dream of full equality was pushed back, but not erased. Each setback reminded the community that freedom required constant defense. The lesson echoed the past. Systems of control do not disappear easily. They adapt. Resistance must also adapt. In the 20th century, as the civil rights movement demanded an end to segregation, leaders often spoke of the long history of struggle. Though they did not always name Vesey directly, his spirit lived in the idea that injustice must be confronted, not quietly accepted. Sit-ins, marches, court cases, and speeches became the new strategies. The form of resistance changed, but the determination remained connected to earlier generations. Today, when historians study Vesey's life, they face the challenge of limited sources. Most records were written by those who condemned him. Extracting truth from hostile testimony requires careful analysis. Scholars compare statements, examine timelines, and search for consistency. This process reminds us that history is not just a collection of facts. It is an interpretation shaped by power and perspective. Understanding Vesey requires reading between lines written by his enemies. Modern debates about how to remember him reveal how alive his legacy remains. Some view him as a freedom fighter, whose actions fit within a broader struggle against dehumanization. Others struggle with the reality that his plan involved killing. These conversations are not simple, and they should not be. Mature understanding accepts complexity. It recognizes that people in extreme circumstances make extreme choices. As you reflect on this full journey, from a young boy captured in the Caribbean to a free carpenter in Charleston, from secret meetings in a church to a scaffold in the summer heat. Consider the thread that connects it all. It is not only anger. It is not only faith. It is not only strategy. It is the refusal to accept that injustice is permanent. That refusal is dangerous to systems built on control. It is also necessary for change. Denmark Vesey did not see the Civil War. He did not witness emancipation. He did not walk freely in a nation that outlawed slavery. Yet his willingness to challenge the strongest structures of his time contributed to a larger momentum that eventually transformed the country. History often moves through layers of effort. One generation plants seeds, another waters them. A later generation harvests change. If you have listened from beginning to end, you now carry the story forward. Memory depends on retelling. Ask yourself what responsibility comes with knowing. Ask yourself how courage appears in your own life and time. It may not look like marching toward a harbor with weapons. It may look like standing firm in conversations, demanding fairness, or protecting the vulnerable. The scale changes. The principle remains. Denmark Vesey stands in the shadows of Black history, not because he failed, but because his attempt revealed truths many preferred to hide. He revealed that slavery bred resistance. He revealed that unity could form even under heavy surveillance. He revealed that fear lived in the hearts of the powerful as much as in the oppressed. That revelation alone altered the psychological landscape of the South. And so his shadow continues not as a simple tale of violence, not as a perfect hero story, but as a reminder that freedom has always required courage, risk, and imagination. The imagination to see beyond chains, the courage to act on that vision, the risk of paying the highest price. Thank you for staying with Shadows of Black History through every part of this powerful journey. Tell us once more where you are watching from. Your city, your country, and the time there right now. If this story kept you thinking, if it sparked curiosity, if it challenged you, make sure you subscribe and like so that more hidden histories rise from the shadows. Stay attentive, stay thoughtful, and remember that every shadow holds a story waiting to be understood.